I properly met, I think it was in January. Is that right, Sam?
Yes, yeah, it seems
Yeah,
a long time
yeah.
ago now.
So I've known about Sam for a while, which is always really freaky when people tell me that they've known about me, but I've known about you for a while. So I've been able to stalk you for a while in other worlds. But Sam works up at the Newcastle, Northumbria, where there is a fantastic number of realist researchers up there, including Sonia Dalkin, that I'm sure you're all aware of. And Sam is an assistant professor in the School of Communities and Education. Wow, what an interesting name for a department. I like that. So Sam's expertise lies in the evaluation of complex interventions and the application of realist methodological approaches. She also serves as a realist research methodologist for the NIHR Research Support Service Hub, delivered by Newcastle University and partners. Gosh, Sam, you must be a really well sought after colleague in your department if you're part of the RSS as well, because that's an interesting number of different skill sets that you need to do that. And so Sam's research is grounded in earlier professional experience within local authority public health and social care commissioning, which informs her applied approach to service design, implementation, delivery, and evaluation research. Absolutely awesome. We should definitely have coffee because there's lots we could talk about. So her work is very collaborative, interdisciplinary, and oriented towards producing findings with practical relevance and explanatory depth, which I think is something that epitomizes realist approaches, really. So Sam uses realist methodological approaches to strengthen the theoretical and practical dimensions of research, and she has extensive experience applying realist principles across diverse fields, including public health, social care, criminology, and education, contributing to a nuanced understanding of how and why interventions work in specific contexts. Gosh, Sam, that's awesome. Although we met properly, we didn't really discuss much, did we? We just chatted. So, yeah, I think we could probably have some very interesting conversations.
I think that'd be good.
Yeah. So today, Sam is here to talk about realist topic guides. So think about your interview, and we get loads and loads of questions about this at the Realist Hub. Sam, we get around ethics. How detailed should they be? How can you persuade people that you need to iteratively refine the questions that you ask? You know, all of those common questions that come up again and again and again. So if they're not covered in your presentation today, which I'm sure they are, they will definitely come up as questions for later. So what I would like to say to people is, as Sam is going through a presentation, can you pop your questions for Sam in the chat, and we will come to them all at the end, if that's all right with you, Sam? Yeah.
Sounds
So
good.
I'm just going to hand over to you, and happy December to everybody. I learned about Sinterklaas actually on Monday from my realist training. So those of you in the Netherlands, if there's anyone here, that is a fantastic tradition, and apparently you can't put your tree up until Sinterklaas has happened. So you can go and look that up, and I'd be very interested afterwards learning about other Christmas traditions that take place across the world. But yeah, I hadn't heard of Sinterklaas. That was an interesting one. All right, over to you, Sam.
Oh, right. Okay, well, thanks ever so much for the introduction, Joe. So yeah, for those of you that don't know me, I'm Sam Redgate, so I'm based up at Northumbria University in Newcastle. So the presentation I'm going to do today is sort of based on the Realist Topic Guide, which is a chapter that I co-wrote with Sonia Dalkin. However, it's just me presenting today as Sonia is off on maternity leave. What I want to do today is kind of talk about how topic guides can help us enact principles when we're sort of in the field doing our data collection. What I don't want to do is this isn't a definitive sort of how to do topic guides within realist research. It's more of a sort of a discussion points and things for you to consider as you're conducting your realist research and as you're looking at things like sort of developing topic guides. So, there we go. So basically, in terms of what I'm going to go through, we're going to look at sort of positioning of the topic guide and different types of questions that we might have. I'm going to look at how we go about choosing the right questions. And I'm then going to go through a stepped approach that we developed within the chapter about how we might want to go about designing a topic guide in practice. So in terms of sort of what are topic guides within realist research? In its simplest form, a topic guide is literally just a list or an outline of the key issues to be explored or questions to be asked within an interview or focus groups. And the guides really sort of act as sort of a practical tools for researchers. So they help us steer the discussions, they help us keep to time, and help us ensure that we've got key questions or we've got key areas of focus or included in the conversation so that we can actually answer and gather data for our overall research question. The topic guide must, however, be fit for purpose for both the researcher and also in facilitating the intended outputs from the discussion. So therefore, the design of the topic guide is a really important process, and it needs to be informed by the methodological approach that you're undertaking within the study. Within realist interviewing, there's a focus on the use of theory to drive questioning, with a suggestion that theory should be used explicitly and systematically throughout the interview process. So this focus itself helps lend to the topic guide approach rather than an interview based on narrative, whereby we can look at aspects of theory and we can highlight specific aspects of theory within the topic guide in order for them to be investigated further. Within realist approaches, the research process itself is very iterative in nature. You've got sort of initial theorizing, theory gleaning, initial theory program development, for example, is then followed by cycles of testing and refinement prior to the consolidation of your theories. So therefore, there's a need to identify and be able to be adaptive to patterns of information that's emerging from your interviews as they go on, as well as any other additional sort of data sources, and that you're able to reflect these in your questioning in your topic guide as you move forward. This interaction as well with and sort of further development of program theory. So due to its iterative cycle, there's a requirement really for the realist topic guide to be considered differently to the non-realist topic guide. We typically see non-realist topic guides sort of being grounded in more constructivist approaches and principles, but the realist topic guide needs to be sufficiently flexible. And this is really to allow us to test the program theory and for the excavation of new emerging explanatory areas as they come up through the interviews process or focus groups. So by taking this approach and being sort of iterative and looking at sort of emerging areas, we can start to look and think about generative causation and how generative causation might be identified and explored in relating to the key contextual and mechanistic aspects and the outcomes that they might lead to. So in essence, the realist topic guide needs to have a requirement to ensure that it's structured in such a way that can facilitate dialogue. It needs to be able to identify and explore the key context, mechanism, and outcome components and their links. Really, we've got this overarching aim to inspire, validate, falsify, or modify your program theories. So, in terms of what do we need to think about when we're thinking about the realist topic guide, realist research starts and ends with theory. It aims to develop, refine, validate, falsify theories pertaining to a program and identifying how the program does or doesn't work for whom and why. There's therefore a focus on developing your conceptual understanding, and you want to look at this understanding and think about it in relation to a number of things. So, for example, the context that the interventions are situated in, the mechanisms that are generated in response to the intervention delivery within the context, and also the outcomes of interest. The interviews themselves often use sort of the teacher-learner cycle, and this is important to consider when developing your topic guides. You need to think about how your program theories are going to be taught to your participants and how questions can be structured to elicit this information to allow the participant to then teach the researcher. And I think it's important to note that this teaching isn't necessarily done as a formal word-for-word citation of the program theory. For a lot of people, that wouldn't work, and your participants might be wondering what on earth you're on about. So the researcher needs to use their discretion to present program theory in the most appropriate format and in the most appropriate terms for your research participant. So this is going to look different depending on who your participant is. In practice, when we're thinking about sort of the teacher-learner cycle approach, I've got an example here that the researcher might state that they'll be presenting the participant with ideas. So this is basically you telling the participant about your program theory, but you're using different terminology. So you might say that you're going to be presenting them with ideas about an intervention, a policy, a service, etc. And this is you teaching the participant about your theory, or at least elements of the theory. And also that you'd like the participant to respond with their thoughts and experiences to the information presented. So this is then basically the participant teaching the researcher about their theory, putting that additional information on there. And this approach is different to interviews using other philosophical paradigms, because there tends to be sort of the focus will often be on exploring participants' views on the topic under investigation and to capitalise on lived experience. So instead, we're looking very much at this sort of theory development within Realist. So in terms of what this might look like in practice, I've just got an example here. So your program theory might, for example, state engaging in group work allows participants the opportunity to discuss their experiences of implementing new coaching strategies, which allows them to learn from one another and deepens their practical understanding of and confidence in the topics learnt, leading to increased application of the learning in the real world situations. Now, I don't know about you, but I think if I was to go to someone and say that, they'd probably sort of sit there and try and sort of start to unpick it in their head, depending who you were talking to. It might not really make a lot of sense. So it's rephrasing it in a way that's fit for purpose. So I've got an example here that instead of putting that program theory like that to the participant, we asked, it seems that group work allowed you to work through more practical applications of the strategies you had learned on the course. Could you talk to me about your experiences of this? And you might then go on to use additional prompts to ensure you're trying to elicit the particular context or mechanisms and outcomes within that. Underpinning the structure of the topic guide is the notion of generative causation, which runs through all of realist research, isn't anything new. But what we can do by focusing questioning within the topic guide on propositions, it can allow for the interviewer to express their view or their judgment as part of the actual question that's being asked. And so in doing so, questions aligning with the program theory can start to be tested, can start to be more easily asked. It also allows us to incorporate this notion of sort of the teacher-learner cycle into the actual discussions themselves. So within realist research, what we've suggested is there are different question types. And so by focusing on identifying the different question types within the realist topic guide, we can start to begin to interrogate how can questions actually be structured to inform theory development in relation to different theory configurations. And here we might be looking at configurations just being individual, didactic or tridactic. It just depends whereabouts within sort of the theory process you've got to. So within the book chapter that I mentioned at the beginning that this presentation is reflecting, we've actually got this diagram, and Sonia and I sort of came up with it, and we're suggesting that there's two types of questions that should be in the researcher's toolkit when developing topic guides. So here we've got depth in specific component. So this type of question's implicit in relation to exploring program theories. So for example, the researcher asked the questions to direct the participant narrative towards the program theory, but isn't going to explicitly outline the full program theory. So here, and in this sense, it's the researcher's role to explore the in-depth different components of the C, the M, the O's through questioning, but also always at the back of your mind to keep sight of the configurational aspect to ensure that the interview remains realist. Depth in configuration, on the other hand, is explicit in the exploration of program theory. So here, program theories are presented to participants, as I mentioned before, not necessarily in terms of reading them your program theories. It stands making sure that it's fit for purpose, the terminology you're using. And questions are structured based on the configurational aspects of the theory. So, for example, you might be looking to gather information on generative causation. You're wanting to identify links between different components within the program theory. But how do we go about choosing the right type of question? What kind of question do we need? So depth in specific components and depth in specific configuration questions aren't standalone. They can be viewed as tools in assisting researchers in maintaining theoretical awareness, whilst also establishing generative causation between the various components of context, mechanisms, and outcomes within the interview itself. And so we propose that these question types are going to be iterative, both within and between interviews. And the idea here is that they're able to assist with overall program theory refinement, adhering to, but also uncovering generative causation. Also, it's worth noting that the two question types are able to blend with one another, and this is especially sort of within the flexibility that's required within the realist interview. So just for example, if a participant moves more towards explanation of a configuration when you've asked a depth in component question, we'd still encourage the researcher to allow this excavation of CMO configuration. However, and I think this is as with all realist research, it's a messy and complex process, which is going to look different depending on the individual study and the actual interview itself. So although I can talk through this as a nice structured process, I think we've got to bear in mind that as soon as we go into the field, some of these elements start to get a little bit more messy and complex. So when you're looking to identify the type of question needed, there are several factors as well that you might want to take into consideration. And these will include things like the phase of the interview. So are you looking at more theory gleaning? Are you sort of a little bit more further on, even looking at refining or even consolidating your program theory? You want to think about the questions that are being asked, also the participants' engagement with the program, and also the researcher themselves. So it should also be noted that theory shouldn't really be refined solely through a single interview, but rather by the idea of combining and triangulating other evidence. So this could be other interviews, it could be other data collection methods you've got within the project, or it could be sort of literature examining that specific theory in same or similar programs. And in doing so, the data generated through your interview can be added to or could be contrasted with other evidence. And really the whole point of this is to enhance the explanatory potential of the data that you're collecting. So what does this look like in practice, or what might it look like in practice? I've broken this down to theory gleaning, theory refining, theory consolidating to see, okay, what might it look like in practice? So when we're in sort of the theory gleaning phase of the research, we're sort of having those initial conversations, trying to understand what's going on. Your topic guides are more likely to focus on depth in specific components-based question. And this is to identify core context, mechanisms, and outcomes pertaining to a programme. The idea though behind this and ensuring that we're keeping the interview realist is we're looking for ideas of potential dyads or possible even triad linkages. So we're still looking to have those identified links between context, mechanism and or outcome. So within the interview, the narrative's directed towards program theory and through questions within the topic guide that you've got, but without explicitly outlining the full program theories themselves. And so here it's the researcher's role to explore in depth different components of the context, the mechanism, and the outcomes through questioning, but always keeping sight of the configurational aspects to ensure the interview itself remains realist. I've got a little bit of a word of caution at the bottom though, because it's not always going to be this way. You're not always going to start sort of theory gleaning with depth and specific components. Interviews where you might start from a more advanced knowledge base. So for example, you might have already undertaken a detailed literature review, undertaken sort of a realist synthesis or something. You might look to instead therefore focus on more depth in configurational approaches because you've already got very sort of concrete formulated program theories. So thinking about the theory refinement phase of research, typically at this point, your topic guides are probably going to be redrafted to reflect the theories being refined. Again, going back to the idea of sort of this iterative nature of realist research. So you're likely to shift to more of a depth in specific configurational approaches here. And the idea behind doing that is because emerging sort of CMO configurations are starting to need to be explored. In terms of you doing this, you tend to sort of explicitly present the program theories to your participant, but this doesn't need to be as in word for word program theory. So you'll provide some kind of verbal explanation and you might use other processes for this as well. So we've got things like sort of written prompts could be used. You might have narrative illustrations such as vignettes or pen portraits, or you might even have pictorial illustrations such as diagrammatic in visuals or even sort of cartoons or photos, etc. So there's a lot of different ways you can go about presenting your program theory. When we reach sort of the theory consolidation phase of the research, your topic guides typically focus more on depth in specific configuration because what you're looking to do here is to confirm and consolidate your final program theories. However, depth in specific components might still be required because you might need to understand specific aspects of either the context, mechanism, or outcome within your program theory in a little bit more detail. Here, there's very much still this notion of iteration. So you're moving focus between your ongoing analysis, both within and between interviews, but also the question types that you're going to need to be able to assist you with actually gathering this information. And I've got another sort of word of caution at the bottom here that the topic guides might include questions on both depth in configuration and depth in components. You don't need to have a topic guide that just solely has one type of question. So you may, for example, begin by exploring depth in components within a single interview and then move to more towards depth in configuration within the same interview. So we've gone through different question types, when they might want to be used, how they might want to be used, but how do you actually go about putting this together in practice? Again, sort of within the within the book chapter, Sonia and I came up with this stepped approach in developing a realist topic guide. One thing I think it's also worth bearing in mind is, although the steps here are presented sequentially, in practice, again, the process is likely to be more iterative. And there's going to be movement between repetition of some of these steps. And this iteration is really seen in response to emerging data from the research. So what I'm going to do now is take you through each of these 6 steps in how we might want to go about designing our topic guide. So in terms of step 1, what is already known and what is not known? A useful topic guide that facilitates the participant in able to share their relevant knowledge is going to be grounded and carefully crafted in your programme theories. Again, going back to the notion of realist research, it starts and ends with theory. Although questions are going to be focused on the programme theories, the programme theories themselves are not the interview questions. So following the development of initial programme theories, it's important really for you to consider now, okay, what's known versus what are the known unknowns, i.e. what's going to require further investigation to focus your questioning in the topic guide. But you also need to acknowledge that there's going to be unknown unknowns, which I always think is a bit of a weird phrase. So i.e., what things don't we know that we don't know? So in this sense, really sort of the knowns are something tangible. It's something that we're able to ask questions about, it's something we're able to explore further. The known unknowns are what requires further investigation. So we might want to sort of focus the questioning on the topic guide, whereas the unknown unknowns are things we've got no idea that we don't know. Thinking as well about this when we're thinking through what we might want to include, what we already know, what we don't know, this actual process on itself on a practical level, this designing of the topic guide, structuring of the questions can provide space for reflection and focusing of your existing programme theories. It can also help to identify gaps in the knowledge as well that we might want to explore further within the interviews. So in terms of what this might look like in practice, if we're exploring the known, we might, for example, know that social dynamics in a group work is a key context, but we might need further explanation of, okay, how does this fit within a configuration? So therefore, this will prompt a depth in configuration type question. We're looking to understand that configurational aspect, that generative causation. In terms of exploring the unknown, we might say sort of often causal links are tentative, or we might have confidence in 1 or 2 components, but need to know more about the final one. So here you could either use a depth in configuration or depth in specific component question type. It's going to be dependent on your research topic and the data that you've got to date. So these 2 approaches aren't mutually exclusive, and it's anticipated there's going to be some iteration between the question type, both within and between interviews. Moving on to step 2, we want to identify, okay, so who is relevant to interview, and what are their areas of expertise in relation to the programme. And the idea here is sort of participants in realist studies are often selected in relation to their potential to contribute to discussions on causations. You want them to be able to help you build and refine theory about what's worked, for whom, how, in what circumstances, and why. Rather than just being sort of a representation of a broad population under study. So it's really important to think about who you're asking to interview. So you need to consider who the participant is and what they might be able to contribute to theory development. So i.e. what parts of the programme theory might they be able to provide relevant knowledge on. And it's important to note here that you don't need to ask all your participants the same questions or even the same type of participant, i.e. sort of those receiving the interventions might actually need to be asked different questions. It's all going to be based on their experience, and their relevant knowledge may not be the same as a fellow participant. So as the interview progresses, questions are going to become further tailored in response to information provided by the participant. In terms of step 3, here we're looking to sort of formulate relevant questions using depth in components and or depth in configuration questions. So going back to this idea of different question types within the topic guide. So when designing a topic guide, you need to identify and think about how the answers to the questions are going to be used. So I've got here a quote, because it's not simply by asking sort of what the evaluation questions, but instead asking for what were the answers being used. And I think this is a really good way of really trying to sort of focus what it is you need from the questions. What are you going to be doing with the data that they're able to provide? So by asking depth and component type questions, you can use to provide focus on exploring individual or didactic components of a theory. And on the other hand, if you're using depth and specific configuration questions, you can provide a more nuanced account of the postulated generative causation between the various components. So again, sort of taking this approach allows for questions to be structured in such a way that can assist with theory gleaning, refining, or consolidating, depending on what aspect and what part of your research journey you're on. It's important at this step also to phrase your questions like a realist. The idea here is you need to focus on theory development. You want to be looking at uncovering generative causation, whilst also keeping in mind sort of the type, so i.e. depth in component or depth in configuration of questions that you think you might need. Questions really need to sort of focus on the program theory, whilst also exploring the how, where, when, and why programs are or are not effective. So in terms of what this might look like in practice, we've got here, so for example, exploring a context, social dynamics of group work in an interview with the aim of identifying how it's linked to outcomes. We asked, I understand that in circumstances where you feel comfortable with other members of the group that allowed you to talk through experiences and practical application of learning with other coach developers, what impact has this had on your learning from the course outside of the learning from the course outside of the course? Do you think this would have been different had you not felt comfortable in that group? So we're looking there to really try and unpick and understand how sort of the context might be linked, how the different components are within there and what they are. Looking sort of the other type of question, if we were to look at this more in depth and specific configuration, here, if we were looking at theory on peer support, for example, where the context is social dynamics in group work, the mechanism is group work, learning approach, and learning attitudes, and then the outcome is coach developer community. We're wanting to see more of this configurational aspect, so we might ask something along the lines of, from observing some of the sessions, it seems that the group work you're participating in has meant that you have to talk and discuss your thoughts and approaches to coaching with some of the other coach developers. And from this, new relationships have built. Can you tell me a bit more about this? So again, we've tried to put the program theory to the participant, but in such a way that they're able to then provide their comment on it. And we haven't tried to bombard them with terminology such as context, mechanisms, and outcomes and ask them to understand it all within the space of the interview. Okay. Step 4, we're stating sort of to be flexible and adaptive throughout the interview. There's a need to be for flexibility and adaptiveness throughout the realist interview, and I think throughout realist research within general. A lot of this flexibility within the interview itself is going to have to be in the moment, and this is in response to any kind of emerging data that the participant might disclose enacting that teacher-learner cycle. If you're going to be able to react in the moment, it demands a thorough knowledge of the program theories under investigation, or at least the ones that you're going to be presenting to the participant prior to actually going out and entering the field. Having this knowledge is going to allow you as an interviewer to be able to be agile and to respond to the expertise of the participant in the interview. This can be facilitated using sort of follow-up questions that you might pose within the teacher-learner cycle, and this can help encourage participants to elaborate and provide further detail on the points that they've made. In addition, it also allows for this flexibility should these unknown unknowns emerge. So sort of before, when I was talking about we don't know what we don't know, things might come up within the interview that you haven't previously considered, you haven't previously theorized about. So being able to be flexible, being able to be adaptive will allow you to respond to these. Okay, step 5, we've got sort of post-interview reflection to refine the theories. And I think this is a really important step, which sometimes I think when we're working in large groups of researchers, we maybe don't do that much of, or not as much as we should. After the interview, there's a need really to be reflective. You need to ask yourself, okay, so what went well? What questions yielded good responses? What worked? What didn't work? and try and understand why this was. Was it the way the question was phrased, for example, or was it because the participant didn't have the relevant knowledge to answer it? This whole reflective process really allows you to consider whether any changes are needed in the topic guide in relation to explanations or in relation to sort of phrasing to better facilitate the participant in providing you the information that you need, really in relation to sort of theory gleaning, refinement or consolidation. However, and I think it's important to remember that sometimes one participant might find a question difficult to answer and another participant might find the same question easier. And this might just be due to relevant personal experience. So you need to take a pragmatic approach. Even though sort of one question might not have worked well, you might not have to radically change the whole thing prior to the next interview. So you need to have this sort of deep reflective space to understand, okay, do I need to change this question or is it okay as it stands? Step 6, the last step within the process that we've got here, we've suggested that you need to have an iterative cycle of reconstructing and refining the topic guides. And just going back to one of Joe's points in the introduction about ethics, this can be quite problematic in terms of your ethics and at what point do you put your ethics approval in and what do you need to have in terms of ethical amendments for any kind of changes to the topic guide as you go through. The topic guide in realist research is iterative, not only in relation to the type of question used, but also in reflection of the refinement theory as your data collection progresses. And this iteration should develop and transform as the researcher's thinking does. As you start to gather more information, more data through interviews, you might need to use this in order to sort of include within your analysis to inform your thinking, to identify refinement of program theories, to identify potential new questions to ask. So this sort of transformation, this iteration, is sort of a key concept, really, the realist topic guides. The idea is, as the researcher gets wiser, the topic guide should be amended to incorporate these new dimensions that were maybe sort of potentially previously uncovered within interviews. And also, this might also reflect other data collection methods within the study, depending on the breadth of the study itself. So ideally, the topic guide should be reflected upon after each interview in order to identify if any additional amendments in light of the new knowledge are required. However, in practice, it's very difficult to do. And for example, if there are multiple researchers using the same topic guide, you might not have the time to sort of work together to have that reflective space. Or if there's little time between the interviews themselves, sometimes just practically you might have had to schedule all your interviews within a particular time frame, and it's having that space to be able to reflect in between. So I'd suggest that sort of a pragmatic approach to whether the topic guide needs to be updated, what kind of new learning needs to be reflected should be taken. So in terms of in practice, what this reflective aspects within the topic guide might look like, you might need to think about your questions. A question might need to be taken out or given less priority within the topic guide if you feel you've actually already got sufficient evidence on it. You might have a question that needs to move from a depth and component question type to a depth and configuration type question, or vice versa. There might be a new area of program theory that hasn't previously been considered that needs to be further explored, sort of one of these unknown unknowns, and this might require either sort of a new question or even a whole new topic area within the guide. You might have sort of you might put a focus more on questions that explore program theories, which is currently scarce data. So again, this is as you go through, if there's particular program theories you're not really getting the information for, you might want to adapt questions and focus more on that area. And also, you need to be practical. We're undertaking research in the real world. There might be a change in circumstances surrounding the intervention. So a new policy could be introduced as you're working through the research. Intervention might attract a lot of press attention, which dramatically changes how it's perceived by people. So you need to be able to respond to these changes. So in summary, the Realist Topic Guide should be focused on theory development. The whole point here is we're looking to uncover sort of generative causation, and it needs to be sort of in line with the underpinning principles of realist research. In terms of actual questions within the topic guide, these can be grouped by program theory and will contain patterns of depth in specific components and depth in specific configuration questions within them. And it's important here to think that you don't just have to have one type of question within a particular interview, you might have both. the whole process of defining, considering your question types and the question structure within the topic guide can be interrogated to inform your theory development. So it allows you this additional space to think through your program theories, to think through the development of such, and how you might go about eliciting sort of further information on them. So this, in relation to sort of configurations, could be individual, could be didactic, or could be tridactic. Again, it depends on what your focus of the interview is and whereabouts you are on that sort of research process. And then finally, we've got sort of a suggested stepped process of developing a topic guide that bridges the gap between linking these theoretical constructs of a realist methodology with a more tangible process. So as I mentioned at the beginning, we're not putting this forward as a definitive, this is how you should do topic guides, but more of things to think about when you're putting together your topic guides, more of giving you ideas of things to discuss, things to consider, things to think about that might help enact those realist principles within sort of the field through the use of topic guides. And then I've just finally got references there for anybody that wants to follow up on anything, but I think they've also been put in the chat. So I'd just like to finish by saying thank you very much for listening. So I suppose
sorry,
it has
really struggled there with the whole mouse thing. I couldn't get it across the screen. I've got two screens and it was stuck on the other one. Sam, that was great. That was absolutely awesome. We've already got questions in the chat, which I think is absolutely fantastic. And I think it's really interesting and tricky. And I think actually what we should have done was we probably should have had my webinar in March followed, or this one come first. I think they would have probably made a good combo to have them closer together. So for other people who are interested in realist interviewing, on the Realist Hub YouTube channel, there's Anna Manzano who interviewed me. So she took my role, which was interesting. In being interviewed by the Queen of Realist Interviewing, that was interesting. So that is also worth having a look at because they kind of go hand in hand. And there was loads of things that you brought up that I think are things that don't necessarily get translated very well in the documents. So, for instance, the way in which your questions are phrased, I've started now to put in supplemental material, some questions, some actual questions lifted from the data, because I think sometimes when you very neatly write the questions down in the topic guide, they look great, but actually those questions never really get spoken in that way because you don't speak in the way that you write it down for a topic guide. So I've started to literally lift, copy and paste from our real data to say, well, look, these are theory gleaning questions, these are theory consolidation questions, and these are theory refinement questions. I do have to say, for everyone else who's interested in that, the paper's not out yet, it's under peer review, so you'll have to wait. But I would encourage people to do that to help those people who are early in their journey understand how you can ask a realist type of question. And
sorry, Joe, I was going to say, I wouldn't just say it's for people early in their journey. I know I've undertaken a lot of realist interviews, but I think we're all always learning and there's different ways of doing it. So it's always useful to see how somebody else has done it and see what you can take from that.
I know I shared transcripts really early on with the team asking, I think they felt really uncomfortable. I was like, can you critique my questions? Can you see other ways that I could have asked them? I think people were uncomfortable about that, but I think we should be stepping more into that open critique space to say, well, actually, you could have phrased this differently. You could have probed differently. Did you realize that you stopped short here of, getting to your mechanism? And I think so. One of the things that comes up a lot in the training that I do is around those mechanisms. And sometimes I've had interviews where people just are not interested in talking about mechanisms and they kind of like shut down those kind of lines of inquiries. However, I still tell people I think they can still be useful interviews because, like you were saying earlier, you might not get the triad, but you might get the dyad of context and outcome coming through. So you can still use that. And it's not necessarily a reflection on your ability as an interviewer. Some people just lend themselves very well to, I think, the realist logic and are happy then once they understand what you want. And other people are like, I'm not telling you what's going on inside my head. I'm just not, that's for me, not for you. So I don't know if that's something you've experienced as well.
Definitely. Yeah, I think all interviews are different. And I know, so drawing on a lot of the examples that are within the topic guide chapter, the topic guide chapter in the book, we interviewed some coach developers, and it was really interesting actually, just because different people were willing to share different aspects, because we were asking quite personal questions, how did you find things like sort of the group work? Some people were willing to share a lot more than others. So and I think it's always going to be like that. Depending on sort of like the research project you got, you're going to have some people that are willing to share, some people that are quite open and able to talk to these various sort of context mechanisms or outcomes that you've got, and other people that really don't want to be there and will just answer the absolute bare minimum just so they can get out the door.
I had people dress up. So I had people like think they were coming to like some sort of like formal, and they were really nervous. So I think, sometimes it's also about how you communicate as well, and what their expectations are, because we have to call them a research interview and actually really you're having a conversation, but they come with sort of like set expectations around what that is going to entail. Anyway, I'm sure you and I could talk all day, and maybe the people in the audience would learn something, but also some of the people in the audience want specific questions answered. So I'm going to come to Laura. Laura's got 2 questions. So Laura, if you want to pop on, if you're free to speak and you want to speak. So I think we can potentially deal with both of your questions at once. So novice interviewers is some, I don't know if you've got my chapter on interviewing. I'm not really allowed to send or to put the chapter out publicly, but if people email me, I can send you the chapter. Alternatively, you can buy the book. It's actually really worth it if you're doing a realist evaluation. It's got some really great chapters in. And if you go back and look on the Realist Hub YouTube channel, a lot of the chapters have been now turned into these webinars. So you can then get extra, I suppose it's bringing the chapters to life. That's how I think of them. Which, anyway, so do you want to ask your 2 questions, Laura?
Yeah, no, so it's just about scheduling your interviews. So with that iterative process, so is it best, so I'm going to be interviewing for my realist evaluation in the new year, all being well. So I'm doing a long time to get my approvals. So I'm doing my data analysis to do my sampling, so a sampling framework to help that selection of different types of people. And then in the new year, I'll be interviewing. And I was actually considering just interviewing everyone all at once. And now listening, I'm thinking I might be better to do 1 set of interviews, 1 set of analysis, then another set of interviews with another analysis, and do it maybe that way, rather than all at once, so that I have that capacity for more refinement.
That's a great question, isn't it, Sam? And actually, I think you could have a whole session just on that, to be honest, because I can already in my head go, you could do this, you could do that, you could do this, you could do that. So I'm interested to see what Sam says first, and then I can also add a bit in, because this is one of those things where, as you've probably already worked out in realist research, there's lots of people doing things in very different ways. So this is one of those scenarios where you have to do what's best for you. But let's see what Sam says first.
Yeah, so I think I'm going to echo that. You need to do what works best for you. And I think there's lots of things to take into consideration. We're not, we can present things when we're writing papers and say, this is the good way to do it. This allows you time to do your interviews, reflect on them, do the analysis, which is what, ideally would be doing. But pragmatically, I suppose, how long is your research project? Have you actually got the capacity within the research project to elongate your interview, your fieldwork data collection, by building in those kind of almost break points to stop and do the analysis? Also, if you do sort of your first round of interviews and you go, oh, actually, I need to speak to people that work in this particular area a bit more. Well, actually, if you've already done your sampling framework and you haven't got anybody within that area, have you got time to go out and find someone? Kind of thing. So this idea of sort of interviewing people that are able to talk to you program theories. I've done projects where we've just had our sampling framework and that's who we've interviewed, and we've tried as a team, ideally sort of having sort of debriefs after interviews to sort of just to talk through them and to try and work out, okay, what kind of things are coming out, what are working well within the questions, what's maybe not. I've also done projects where we've just not had time, and it's literally been a case of, we might have 3 interviews scheduled in one day because you've only got a small window of opportunity in which to actually talk to these people. And so then it's been more of a sort of not really have any reflective guidance on the topic guide, not formally, but maybe sort of in your head, if you're the only person doing the interviews, you can start to think through, and you might sort of adapt your questions slightly. One thing I would suggest doing though is, if you are doing that and you're adapting your questions slightly, is making a note of what it is that you're going to be asking, or sort of additional prompts that you're using, so that you can maybe sort of explore those with other people as well. So that's a very long-winded way of saying, in my mind, I waffle, sorry. In my mind, I think the best thing to do would be to sort of have stop points where you go, right, okay, I'm actually going to give myself some dedicated time to analyze, to look at my program theories based on the sort of the first iteration of interviews, and then go out and complete them, or, you know, have a number of iterations depending on the size of the research project. But with a big caveat, you need to be pragmatic on what would actually work for your specific research project. It's not always going to be possible. So yeah, that's my thinking.
I would, so we can work together, Sam, because we think the same.
Cool.
So I would echo that, because in an ideal world, if everything worked out perfectly, my advice to anybody would be, you do some interviews, and then you take a pause and you do some very basic top level analysis to see where your gaps are in your program theory, and then you do a second tranche of interviews. But in reality, I've never been on a project that's allowed us to do that, not even the PhD. But what I did, which was potentially a little bit crazy, is I had individual topic guides for every single person I interviewed. And so the first topic guide took a long time to produce, and then they did get simpler. So towards the end, I was talking 5-10 minutes for a topic guide, and that allowed me to see how my program theory was developing through every topic guide, because the questions changed so much. And now I did that from a disability reason, because I have a brain injury from a car accident a number of years ago when I was in my early 20s. And I was really freaked out that I was going to get in the interview and forget everything. Obviously, I never did, but that was my worry. So I started that. But it wasn't until analysis that I actually realized I had this awesome trajectory. So what I tried to do, so that was PhD world. And you don't realize as a PhD student how much time you have, because you don't feel like you have any. Welcome to the other side of the fence, and you realize just how much time you had for reading and analysis and thought processes that just doesn't exist on the other side of the fence. So what I tried to do in our current project was little synopses at the end of the interview, really short. I mean, you could maybe even dictate them, because dictation software has improved a lot. Just get out what I think is going on, what I think the gaps are, and then use that to take forward into the next interview. But what I would also advise is, I don't know if you feel the same, Sam, but realist interviewing is exhausting.
Yes.
Yeah, and you need time. So don't cram 6 interviews into a day. You need time between each interview to be able to digest, consolidate, understand, and then work the next one out, don't you? And also to think about what you might change to that topic guide for the next one. If you do 6, you won't have, I don't think you'll get the same explanatory depth.
No, I think I'd agree with that. And actually something that I've used it a couple of times, and then I've just gone, I've not got time. It's actually keeping a fieldwork diary.
Yes.
I found really useful. As I say, I've done it a few times and I thought it was brilliant. And then other times I've just gone, I've not got time to reflect on this. But actually, if I'd just spent that 5-10 minutes, brain dump after the interview, writing notes down, I think it really does help when you come into your analysis, because when you're in that moment, having just done the interview, you've got a really good feel for what are the key things that are coming out, what are the key sort of aspects in terms of the program theories that are ringing true with the participant, what bits actually maybe don't look quite right. So yeah, I really recommend telling yourself you do have time.
I would definitely say that, and I have a slightly different story to tell on that. So when I was doing analysis, I was reading one of the transcripts. I was like, gosh, this is like odd. What was going on in this interview? This is really... And as I read through more and more, I was like, right. So I went back to the notes, the diary notes that I'd made from the day, and I was like, oh, yes, there was actually something going on within the service, and everybody got a little bit rattled about it, and it came across in a really weird way in the interview. So people were sort of not saying things and inferring things and being cryptic in their replies, and you can feel that off the, even though it's flat text because it's already been transcribed, you can feel it lifting off the page, and it just has a different feel to it. So by me going back to those diary notes, I was like, okay, I know exactly what was going on there, and this now makes sense. Whereas I think if I kept those notes, I wouldn't have necessarily made that connection, if that makes sense. So as top tips, if you were going to do an interview, Sam, what would they be? I would be topic guide. Don't put them all together.
I think give yourself time as well before the interview. So we're saying about time
Right.
after the interview to
Yeah.
digest, but actually time before the interview as well. That whole idea of you're probably going to have to think on your feet a bit. So be
Yeah.
really mindful that you know what is it you want to get out of this interview. And I think sort of going back to that quote from Jill that I've got in the presentation, what's the data actually going to be used for, and using that to sort of help your thinking in terms of structuring what it is you're wanting to get out of the interview. So having that good detailed preparation time as well.
I also think that helps you with, I always call that eyes on the prize. What do you want? If you want recommendations, you have to ask the questions to lead you to recommendations. If you want an understanding of what's going on, then you don't necessarily need recommendations. You can stop at that bit. But I also think that it's important that you use that time. I mean, I used to do it on my drives as well. I used to like get into the zone. And if you're going from interview to interview, it's very hard to get into the zone, if that makes sense. So
I think oh, sorry.
Yeah, keep going. Yeah,
Yeah.
just talk over me. It's absolutely fine.
I think another thing is making sure you tailor the interview guide to sort of the topic
Yeah.
guide to the person that you're interviewing. So yes, you're probably going to have your standard topic guide, but actually think a bit about the person and see if you can sort of find out a little bit more about the person you're going to be interviewing before you get there. Is there something that you can sort of make sure that it's relevant to them, because people are going to be more willing to talk to you if it's relevant to them.
So when I did mine, I had I interviewed staff in stroke services, and in stroke services you have loads of physios and loads of OTs, but not very many nurses and not very many speech and language therapists. So what I would do is I would go back to the topic guide I had from the previous speech and language therapist if I was going to be interviewing them, and that would help me refresh what had happened in that interview as well. And then I would go, and I'd usually write on that topic guide things to follow up with. So I would then take the notes that I'd written on that topic guide in that interview and go, now, when I've spoken to speech and language therapists before, they've said this. And that again allowed me to develop those parts of the program theory that were only relevant, on the whole, what works for whom. It allowed me to develop those parts of the program theory related to those particular people. Gosh, I think, Sam, we could do like a whole day on this, just backwards and forwards, because I just think it is like top tips, isn't it? And it's there's not enough of this that comes through in the literature, because you kind of in the method section you just say we did however many realist interviews. That's it.
Yeah.
This all of this discussion that we're having now gets parceled up in about 5 words.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's something that we found when sort of Sonia and I were first sort of scoping out, okay, what kind of thing do we want to talk about topic guides?
Yeah.
Like, well, what is there to say about topic guides? And as we got into it, like, actually, there's loads to
There's
say
a lot.
because nobody
Yeah.
says anything about
Yeah.
them. It's just, we interviewed people with a topic guide. Okay. But actually, how did you go about developing that topic guide?
Yeah.
Why is it important that it's a realist topic guide rather than more of a conventional qualitative interview topic guide? What is it that's going to make it a realist topic guide? What kind of questions you have? And then all of a sudden we ended up with way too many words. And so, yeah.
So we've got like 20 odd people now in the chat.
Yeah,
Do you
sorry.
feel so that in the chat you can put in a yes or a no, and we'll come back to all the questions. But based on the discussions that we've had today, do you feel like you have a bit more of an understanding now about what makes a realist topic guide more realist? And this could be interesting, Sam, because they could have all actually like fallen asleep and not actually there. Let's have a look and see, because the silence in these sessions sometimes gets a bit deafening. Okay, we've got some yeses. Yes, somewhat, says Nikki. Yes. Okay, yeah, okay. Well, that actually is an awesome outcome, because we've done some educating.
I'll take that, yeah.
Yeah. Right. So Laura, do you think we've answered your question all right? Do you feel happy with
Yeah.
you got a bit clearer
Yeah,
direction?
no,
You might have
that's-
just extended your work time though.
It might have covered other people's questions as well, but yeah, and it was just because being a novice interviewer as well, like I haven't got loads. I feel like almost you need to be an expert interviewer then to take on this, on realist interviews. But I don't know how other people feel. But I know that there's loads of other questions.
You do get there. Email me, because my guide does cover novices, and you do get there, and it gets easier as you go on. After my first interview, I completely panicked and put out an SOS on Twitter and tagged in Sonia and Joe Greenhall and Anna Manzano going, oh, I haven't got any mechanisms. And I honestly felt like I was complete drama queen back here in my little house in Warwickshire. But it does get better. It honestly does get better. And you just don't worry too much. You go into your first interview petrified, and actually you just want to sit down and have a nice conversation about some things that you want to explore. That's all you're trying to do. So pick the questions that make sense to you as well. I think that's important, Sam, as well, that you ask questions that reflect you and your personality. Otherwise, I think if you don't feel comfortable asking the question, it's not going to come across right in the interview. I don't know what your experience is of that. So I would imagine you and I could ask them similarly, but a bit different because it reflects our different personalities.
Yeah, I think it's got to, because otherwise you're going to end up tripping over your words, stilting, not really understanding what it is you're asking, and that's going to come across. But I think one thing that you need to think about there is if you've got maybe a team of interviewers, if you've got maybe sort of a really large research project, is having this sort of time to maybe talk everybody through, and the fact that you can ask the questions slightly differently, but what is it about each question you're trying to get at to make sure that everyone's still coming from
core
the
element,
same.
isn't there?
Yeah.
So hopefully that's helped you. We'll move on. So we've got Sandra next. So Sandra, again, if you want and are able to, you can welcome to pop on. So as you're developing theory, can you go back and re-interview a participant to test a new theory or an iteration of the theory? Short answer is yes, but come on, Sam. Pass on words of wisdom.
Yeah, again, I would say yes, you can do, but it kind of almost comes back to, again, this sort of pragmatic approach. You know, what's actually going to work for the research that you've got? Have you got sort of consent to re-interview that participant, or at least to recontact them? So from sort of an ethical point of view, do you have time? So from more of a pragmatic point of view, have you scheduled your data collection? This is my data collection window. I cannot move it. So there might not actually be time to go back again. But I think ideally, I would always like to sort of ask people at the end of an interview, would they be willing to be contacted again? Because you might think, oh, actually, that person was really good for this particular theory if I'd asked it at sort of a slightly different way. Also, it might be dependent on, for example, you given participants vouchers, and therefore actually you've only got so many interviews you can do and you don't have the funding to go back and interview somebody else. So it's more thinking through, okay, how will conducting additional interviews sit within the larger research project itself, and just having that sort of pragmatic focus on whether or not you can. But I'd say ideally, yes, if you need to, go back and re-interview them.
Especially if you think they can contribute. I think that's another thing to look at with these, isn't it? Like literally if I was to re-interview this person, what do I think I'm going to get? And actually the re-interview might not be the same length of time, because you might just want to focus on a particular component. I re-interviewed for my PhD, I re-interviewed all of my service leads, and from a Manzano, skipping through the types of theory processes, I had theory gleaning interviews with them initially, if I'm being honest, just learning about the processes, very few mechanisms, just trying to learn how things were conducted. When I went back at the very end of the research, they were like the last people I interviewed again. It's fantastic. I really went to town on a lot of the stuff. So for me, that was worth it. But I didn't interview some of the staff again, because I could still do the theory development, my interview and other stuff. So you just have to work it out, I think, as to what's relevant for you. So all right, Sandra, do you think we've answered it? I mean, we can keep going, I'm sure.
Yeah, that's really helpful. The other thought I had was, if you're developing theory, then if you've got somebody else in a similar role, perhaps you could then kind of carry on that kind of theory development with another individual, but who's got some similarities in terms of characteristics with the previous person.
Yeah.
Definitely. So I think you need to think, okay, who is best placed to talk to me about whatever particular phenomena or aspect that you wanted to talk about, and is that person you've already interviewed actually best placed, or as you say, is there somebody else that might be able to give a slightly different perspective on it? So it's kind of trying to think through, okay, what do I need out of this interview, so therefore who's best placed to provide that information?
Now, I think the next question from Rebecca is interesting, and this is a project I'd love to be involved in. So I personally don't have any knowledge of realist topic guides with children. However, my brain is exploding with ways that this could be done. I'm desperate to get involved with a Lego study. So someone just create a co-produced study that we can go and use all of these Lego kits on, and just invite me to join, because I would love that. And I just think there's loads of different ways that you could use kids, but actually pediatric research is pretty thin on the ground anyway, and I don't know of any in realist methods. So does anyone else? Do you know of any, Sam? Yeah,
my PhD.
Awesome.
So for my
PhD,
for my PhD, I looked at, and I'm gonna put a big caveat out there, I was learning a lot. I think I've focused it as, or phrased it as, realist informed, which I know a lot of people don't like. So
you're saying exactly what I say when I say about my PhD. However, don't look at this section, don't look at this section, and don't look at this section. So before you go any
But-
further with that, is your PhD searchable through eThesis if people
Yes,
want to?
it is.
So,
Yeah.
right.
And also
Okay.
there's a publication from it, giving an overview. But within there, I interviewed young people who offend. Now, it wasn't a huge number, but what I did with them is because also these young people who offended had speech, language, and communication needs. So I wanted to do something that would kind of incorporate them and give them something to do within the interview. It wasn't just going to be me talking to them. So in terms of the topic guide, it was very much, I had my set questions, but we had a great big piece of paper and I was using their journey through the criminal justice system as almost sort of like a map. So we had something to do together. So it's not sort of an example of a topic guide as such, but in terms of just different ways of engaging with sort of children, young people, the fact that we sat with this great big piece of paper and we were both basically writing on it and writing about their journey. So as we were writing about their journey, it allowed me to then sort of ask them questions about that. So the topic guide was essentially focused on 4 phases within their their journey within the criminal justice system. And yeah, this just allowed us to kind of broker that, kind of ensuring that they felt at ease and allowed sort of more of a conversation rather than just me being the adult in the room asking them questions.
Rebecca, I don't know if Rebecca's still here because I don't know if I've got everyone or not. Yes, you are. I can see. I've just found you. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, what sort of ages were they? Because we're looking at working with slightly younger children. So I've done some realist interviews and focus groups with like young people, so 17 to 24-year-olds, but not any like younger.
Young.
Yeah, so I'm trying to think, I can't think off the top of my head how old they would have been, but I know they wouldn't have been younger than 10 because 10's the age of criminal responsibility. And I think we were more looking at sort of 12 to 16-ish, but this is me trying to remember from quite a few years ago. But yeah, so my thesis has been published and on eThesis, and there's a paper as well that I've got from it. So I'll find that reference and I can include that in the list as well, if that's useful.
I think this is a great question for the Ramses chat, actually, the JISC mail, because I think this is quite niche. The other thing I would do is if you're good at prompting, you might be able to get AI to do a structured search for you to see, but you need to be good at prompting with AI to do that, to see if it can identify anyone who's done anything in this area. But if it was me, I'd be leaning into the child co-production field first to get a feel for the activity, if you like, or how you would do that, and then be tagging in the realist bits. I don't think the questioning would be massively different. It'd be your delivery that I think would be the most important thing.
Yeah.
But I think for me, it would be around creating an activity that they would be wanting to take part in. Would they want to have a conversation with me, or would we be like doing something? Would we be, playing or whatever? Interesting. Keep in touch. Let us know how it goes. I'm fascinated now.
Yeah, I'll pop the link to that paper in the chat if it's of any use. But yeah.
So we've got Christella next. How would you translate an interview topic guide into a focus group topic guide when you are doing both? So I'm assuming that means, Christella, that you've got interviews and focus groups, which a lot of people do have, depending on the on how people are able to participate. Would you need to use one or the other depending on the phase of the research? That's like a how long's a piece of string question, and one of those. It depends on your data. Sometimes I feel like we don't really give people like definitive answers. You give them lots of choices, Sam. We give them choices, and I don't know if that makes it easy for them or not. So what's your 2 pence on this one?
So my 2 on this one, so I wouldn't personally look to translate an interview guide to a focus group topic guide because I think they're 2 different things. Which I might get shot for saying, but I think with an interview guide, you're looking very much more for, you're wanting people to expand on their personal experiences. You're probably looking for sort of their involvement, their understanding. As soon as you move it to more of a focus group topic guide, you're looking more for that sort of interaction. So you might be looking to phrase your questions slightly differently because you're wanting to prompt that group engagement. So I would almost argue that an interview topic guide and a focus group topic guide, although they're going to still have the same kind of things, so there's different sort of question types I think you could use within either an interview or a focus group topic guide. I think you would want to structure them differently to either focus in on that sort of group dynamic within the focus group, or on that more sort of individual experience within the interview guide. So
I have questions actually around that, because if you think about interviews and focus groups, they usually form different functions. Focus groups usually have a purpose to produce a direction. So they're usually informing a direction in a certain way, not always, but usually. Whereas interviews tend to be more delving into people's experiences of a certain thing and maybe generating recommendations. So I don't know if that's the same for you, Christella, if that is that your focus groups are doing something different to your interviews, or if you're trying to get same sorts of outputs from both of them. It might be worth just adding in a little bit of context to see if we can help muddle this through for you.
Yes, thank you. Well, we started with the project intentionally wanting to do interviews, but then we realized with certain of the groups we wanted to reach, focus groups might be preferable to individual interviews. So, and for time as well. So it's just thinking how, because even though our team is experienced and I'm experienced with doing interviews and focus groups, the realist part, and how do you make it into a realist focus group, or that's sort of the uncertainty was, and how do we best go about doing it?
Probably how you're phrasing the questions though, isn't it? Because you're looking for causal patterns, aren't you?
So I suppose in that instance as well, you kind of come back to that, okay, what data do we need from this focus group? What data do we need from this interview to sort of starting from that perspective? But then also think through, okay, we know the kind of data we want. Are we looking at more, and I would go to those question types. Since we came up with them, I've sort of started to use them, and it helps me thinking through as well, what kind of aspects of your program theory you're wanting to look at. So I would sort of try and sort of consider your program theories that you're wanting to explore. Are you wanting to look at this depth and configuration, or are you wanting to look at sort of the specific components, and then try and sort of pull out from that and structure your questions around those different question types would be my way of going about it.
That's really useful. Thank you.
I've got DHL outside. I don't know if it's for me or someone else, but the dogs are going mad, so I forgot to take my mic off. And I was just going to say, does that help to answer your question, Christella? Because I think sometimes if you're used to qualitative interviewing, and DHL not coming here, but the dogs don't know that. If you're used to qualitative interviewing, it can feel weird, I think, moving towards realist interviewing, because especially if you've been trained in psychology, so all those like psychology graduates like me out there, where you're used to asking questions in a particular way and then getting the participants to surface whatever responses they want. Realist interviewing is very different because it's more direct. And I think if you're used to a different style of interviewing, you just need to take a step back and think about, what is it about the style that I've been doing so far that I need to slightly adapt? And it is a very slight adaptation for realist work. And one of the things I found, and I don't know if you've experienced this, Sam, with your background, but when I was doing my PhD, it was a bit of a light bulb moment when I realised that my peers, who were all clinicians, had no problems with realist interviewing because they were really used to asking very direct questions. And when I delivered some training in the Netherlands earlier this year, they were like, "Yeah, we're really direct as a nation, so this is that's not a problem for us." So I think some of it might also be like a cultural fact as well. So I don't know if you have any comments for people out there who have previously done sort of like Magdalene thematic analysis type interviewing, and then moving into this space, and how you design the topic guide to ensure you're getting at those generative causation mechanisms.
Yeah, I think it's a hard thing to do, and I think you have to kind of almost check yourself. So I came from more of a sort of general sort of qualitative constructivist kind of background, so it was very much finding out people's thoughts, their experiences about a whole topic, rather than specifically, I want to know about this, which is sort of my program theory. And so it was just thinking about a new way. But I think having that idea of sort of you're looking for the realist logic, you're looking to have that realist logic threaded through your topic guide, threaded through your questioning, threaded through your thinking, threaded through everything. Okay,
yeah,
what are the things that's making this happen? Why are the things being made to happen? You know, what's this context surrounding? What sort of outputs is this creating? But why is it creating these outputs? So having that thinking going on in your head, I think, has helped me in terms of being a lot more directive with my questioning, because otherwise I would just be going, oh, how did you find this service? Whereas actually, no, now I want to find out about the program theories I've already got in relation to the sort of the service, for example. So you need to be more directive with your questioning. So I think it's just having that sort of realist logic almost threaded through and sort of starting to ingrain that in your thinking.
And practice. Do some practice ones. I know it feels really artificial, but it really helps.
Yeah,
for sure. So we've got one more question. I think we've only got one more, and that's from Beth. Now, Beth, I know you had some interview questions last time, so hopefully you feel a little bit more confident, or you have a little bit more knowledge, because this is like 2 lots of things that we've managed to focus on. I'm assuming, of course, that I've got the right Beth, and that I haven't remembered somebody else, and I've got it all mixed up. That I'm talking to someone else who goes, Joe, I have no idea what you're talking about. But if it is you,
me, I'm in the midst
good.
of it.
Good. I have got a memory then that's sort of like half working. So, right. So do you want to chat to Sam about your question? It's quite long.
Yeah, sorry. They're always long, I feel like. Thanks, Sam. Yeah, I was just wondering, because something that's been coming up doing the interviews is that sometimes when I refer to other people rather than the person I'm interviewing, that seems to help them think in a bit of a different way or provide more insight. Is that something you would recommend, or is that wrong? Should I stop doing that?
No, don't stop doing it.
Keep doing it.
Okay.
It comes back to this. I'm not going to actually answer the question, but there's lots of different ways of doing your interviews, and I think for some topics that's going to be really relevant. So all I'm thinking, as soon as you said that we did that in a project where we were looking at sort of families' experiences, and so actually to remove some of that, because we didn't want a great big long story about giving an example of what they did. So it's like, okay, how do you think this would sort of pan out in a family that has this, and almost giving them sort of like a little vignette of, this is our typical family. But then the interviewer was, the interviewee was using their own experience to interpret what we were telling them, sort of within the little sort of vignette case study. So I think definitely for some topic areas, that's really sort of a good thought-provoking way of going about it. And also depend if it's sort of a bit of a sensitive topic area, it might get people to sort of elaborate and think about it and give you a little bit more detail without disclosing or without going into maybe some real sort of personal issues that they've faced. So I think, it comes back to what is your research? What's your research question? What are you looking to get out of the interview or focus group? And making sure that however you are asking your questions, however you are designing your questions, is tailored to that audience, would be my suggestion.
Thank you. That's reassuring.
Completely concur. I do that method all the time, but it only works for certain groups, certain questions.
Okay.
The other one I use a lot, and I don't know if you use it, sounds like the magic one question. All the money and resources, blah, blah, blah in the world, if you could do anything to make it better, what would, or we were sitting on the commissioning board, especially if it's healthcare, we're sitting on the commissioning board and we're going to design a brand new service. What does it need to have in it? And sometimes I find that is quite useful for getting people to remove themselves from the situation and think about from another perspective, but also it helps you work out what isn't working because they tell you what they would put in to make things better. So it's another way at getting at what's not working properly, which they may not have been able to surface properly beforehand, especially when people are talking about where they work, because they're really worried if they're negative, that that will get back to their line manager and they will be seen as being disloyal. So it's just another way of like tapping into what isn't working by working out what will make things better.
Thank you.
I have to say I've used that same approach especially when looking at sort of service evaluation. It's like, okay, well, this is what your service is. Great, you've told me the good bits, the bad bits. If we were to start again and you've got £1 million, or endless money, what would you put into your service? And then all of a sudden you get all this right, and they're the sort of key components from the service that they've already said. So I find that's actually quite a strong question.
It can be a really powerful question, can't it?
Yeah, but it comes back to, okay, who is your interviewee? What data do you want out of the question? What's your research focus? So it keeps coming back to this, what do you need to get out of the interview as to what are you going to be your best ways to structure your question types and ask your questions.
Super helpful, thank you.
Anytime. And I love the accent. I've lost mine. Believe it or not, Beth, I'm from Concert.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
Very
you wouldn't know.
close.
So when I went to university, I was exceptionally broad, very fast. Nobody understood anything. And to survive, I had to slow down and change. So that was a whole story in itself. But yeah, a couple of glasses of wine and with friends in the northeast, and I slip. I don't ever go back fully though, and my family think I'm dead posh like. But yeah, so I am originally from all the way up there. So there you go. So we've got one now question which Laura's added. So how do you go about constructing and applying vignettes? So did Nicola Clibbins use vignettes in one of hers?
Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
So I would suggest, go and have a look at the paper that's in the references for the use of vignettes, because that will go into a lot more detail. But I think it's just another way of engaging with your interviewee and trying to sort of show them, okay, this is kind of what we're thinking. So I know we kind of use them in previous study where we use them to sort of say this kind of almost sort of a case study of what a family composition might look like, about what kind of issues they're experiencing, and then, okay, what would they get out of this service? So you're using it almost, or I was using it in the research project I'm talking about now, to kind of almost sort of detract the person from having to talk about their own very personal and potentially sort of quite triggering experiences, and instead basing their answers on this make-believe family. So it was
so
just
you'll
a
need
different
ethics
way.
for that, won't you, Sam? You'd need to
Yeah.
submit that.
So that was built
would
into
go
the
in at the
ethics.
So it needs to,
Yeah.
if you're something you're thinking about, it needs to be thought about at the beginning of the project. It's not something you could do like partway through unless you
Yeah.
get an amendment.
Yeah, and you would need to actually have done the vignettes as well and put them into ethics, because I want to make sure that they're okay.
Appropriate. Yeah. Well, we've got to the end of our questions, I believe. What an awesome session. Fantastic. So if anyone has any burning questions, you now speak now, forever hold your peace. We've got 10 minutes left. Or you can have 10 minutes of your life back. And in December, that is probably worth about 3 hours. So you can all go off and do whatever it is you need to do. But thank you very much for everyone who's come along today. Give us about a week to get the recording up onto YouTube. But if you've subscribed to the channel, you'll just automatically get a notification when it's being loaded up, and it will be there for the foreseeable for you to come back and use this as a resource. And we always keep the chat on as well, so we don't ever get rid of the chat. I always think sometimes the best questions come through the conversations at the end, and usually they're the ones everyone gets rid of. So we keep these on. So anyway, thank you very much, everyone. Have a good Christmas for those of you who celebrate, and we will see you in January. Hopefully we'll be circulating some information about our next webinar shortly. We're just waiting on some confirmations to come through.
Great. Well, thanks ever so much for having me as well today. It's been really interesting to chat through.